After the release of Metroid Zero Mission in 2004, the Metroid series continued strong into the late 2000s and continued to be an iconic first-party franchise for Nintendo. The Prime series would receive its next 3 games in that time, but would come to a close after the climactic finale of Prime 3. As great as the Prime games are, though, there is no denying that they are radically different from their 2D counterparts, and during this time we never got word on a new 2D main series Metroid game. There were rumors of a secret Metroid Dread project for the Nintendo DS, but that project seemed to have a troubled development cycle, however, so it wouldn't be coming out anytime soon. The next big step forward for the series would be Metroid Other M, a 3D game that would marry the fast-paced action of the 2D series with the detailed worlds of the 3D Prime series. What does any of this have to do with Samus Returns, you might ask? Well, fan reception towards Other M was so polarizing, for a variety of reasons, that it very nearly killed the series, so Samus Returns almost never happened because of it. Enter 2016, 6 years after the release of Other M. Even though Samus was still making regular cameos in other Nintendo games, fans were starved for a traditional Metroid game, especially a 2D one. But fret not, Nintendo had heard our prayers, and that very same year we got word on Metroid Prime Federation Force. And Blast Ball. Yep, Metroid was dead, and Nintendo was trying to milk its mangled, rotten corpse for all it was worth. At least that's what we thought at the time. Fret not, just 1 year later, Nintendo had heard our prayers, and we got word that Metroid Prime 4 was in development on the Switch, and Samus Returns, a fully fledged remake of Metroid 2, would be releasing on the 3DS in just a few short months. This was a magical moment to be a Metroid fan, for sure. Even Nintendo themselves acknowledged the long wait for this game with that title, Samus Returns. They knew that was a big deal at the time, but it really just makes me wonder. What the hell was Nintendo thinking back in 2016? Obviously this game was in development back then, why would they not announce their new mainline Metroid game first, and then afterwards announce their quirky co-op shooter spin-off thing to go with it? Sure would have made Federation Force a lot more palatable, even if we still had to wait for another year. Whatever, the point is that we have a new 2D Metroid game to look forward to. The game was co-developed between Nintendo and Spanish developer MercurySteam, who had previously worked on the Castlevania Lords of Shadow series. I've never played any of those games, but from what I can tell, they seem decent, at the very least being competently made Metroidvanias, so they know their way around the genre. MercurySteam actually originally approached Nintendo about creating a remake of Metroid Fusion. The pitch was rejected, but the team had an obvious love for Metroid, so they were hired on, and their project was repurposed into a remake of Metroid 2, a game that's much more deserving of the remake treatment. So, I've been a Metroid fan for as long as I can remember. I've been looking forward to this game for months. I even had my pre-order ready to go at GameStop. So on that fateful day, September 15th, 2017, I drove 40 minutes from my college dorm all the way back to my hometown to pick it up. I was so ready to play it, and then I impulse bought a Switch that same shopping trip and played Breath of the Wild for a month straight instead. What? Can you blame me? You could barely find these things for months when they first came out. This was the first time I saw a plain black one that wasn't like a Splatoon bundle or whatever. Alright, eventually I got around to Samus Returns, and then I dropped it again when Mario Odyssey came out. It's weird, I was enjoying the game when I was actually playing it, but at the same time I felt like it wasn't really keeping my attention. I felt like it didn't really have that same magic that the earlier games did, but finally, months later, I stuck with it. I beat the game, and I really learned that there is so much more here than I was originally giving it credit for. To me, Samus Returns marks the beginning of a new era for the Metroid series. I was correct that it was fairly different from the games that came before it, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing. Samus Returns does a few things to make the game more accessible in today's age of gaming. It's almost like a proof of concept to see how the series in general could be modernized in future installments beyond this one. It's incredibly apparent now that we have Metroid Dread on the horizon, but I always felt that this game was only the first step towards something greater. That this game's advancements would be kept, and its flaws would be worked out if we ever got future installments that use it as a foundation, which we are. It's exciting to finally know that we are getting something greater out of this game. So let's take a deeper look into Metroid Samus Returns, and see what it does to update the Metroid formula going forward. Once again, the story is the same as the original, but this time we're treated to an opening cutscene that actually explains it to us this time. We get some really stunningly beautiful artwork recapping Samus' Zero Mission, and the Galactic Federation's plan to investigate the home planet of the Metroids, SR-388. Lo and behold, the troops go missing and Samus is sent to finish the job. Samus' ship lands onto the planet, and we get to explore SR-388, for the first time, for the last time. The music starting out is a more subdued, low-key version of the original piece from Metroid 2. while you're starting out and getting a hang of the controls and abilities. Once you get the scan pulse ability, almost as if the soundtrack is growing in power alongside you, the theme suddenly explodes into a more triumphant rendition, more reminiscent of the original tune that I praise so highly. Samus herself also gets some pretty substantial changes. Holding the L button now locks Samus in place, and gives her the ability to free aim in a complete 360-degree range. Samus has never been more accurate before this game, and it makes it easier to snipe at enemies from farther away. Samus' starting mobility is most similar to Fusion's. She can grab ledges by default, but retains that game's nerfed wall jump. I guess it makes sense for it to be this way. Samus Returns is about as linear as Fusion, and having such a broken, easily exploitable move might let the player do a dreaded sequence break. Ooh. Actually, I take it back. I think Samus Returns might be more strict about not sequence breaking than Fusion. Pretty much every item puzzle will have some kind of obstacle, like these wind tunnels that blow away bombs, or the slime that prevents wall jumping and spider-balling. And they make it impossible to get most items out of sequence. It's because of that the wall jump isn't really useful at all, save for one missile tank at the very beginning. Samus also has one last new addition to her standard moveset, the melee counter. Enemies in Samus Returns are way more aggressive than they've ever been previously, and their attacks are telegraphed well in advance. Countering an enemy while it's attacking you will stun it and line it up for a quick and easy shot. It's a really cool and flashy ability that fits Samus' character, but the issue here is that you have to stand completely still to use it, similar to the free aim. Because the enemies are so aggressive, you're going to be using that counter ability a lot, especially in the early game. It's not that easy to just ignore the enemies this time around either, because Samus takes more damage from enemies here than she did even in Fusion. This was the first thing that I noticed about Samus Returns when I first played it, the difficulty. I think this is the hardest game in the whole 2D series, and I died here more times than I can count, even on repeat playthroughs. You have to go through each room and hallway slowly, making sure to counter any enemy that dares to look at you funny. And unfortunately, having to stand still to counter all the time kinda kills the pacing in the beginning of the game. There's a lot of stop and go here, and you don't really have any other way around these guys. Now, granted, this stops being an issue later on when you're given more options to take care of these guys, like the returning Plasma Beam, Power Bombs, and Screw Attack. But you best watch yourself before getting to that point. It's a good thing this game has a new checkpoint system. It puts you just a little bit back from wherever you just died, rather than taking you all the way back to your last save room. This is one of those changes I was talking about to bring Metroid up to more modern standards, and I really appreciate its inclusion here. Look, you can argue that this makes the game too easy or kiddie or whatever, but I just see it as the game not wanting to waste my time. It isn't hard to remember to constantly save all the time, it's just tedious. Speaking of the enemies being more aggressive, let's take a look at the first Metroid battle here. The entire gimmick of Metroid 2 was to go across the entire planet and wipe out every single Metroid one by one, as they mutate into different forms and become more difficult throughout the game. But if you'll remember, it eventually became repetitive to hunt down all the Metroids, and the concept never evolved past shoot them down with missiles until they die. Samus Returns couldn't simply not have the player track down a large number of Metroids. That aspect was fundamental to the original game's design. So in an attempt to improve it, the Metroid fights this time around are a lot more dynamic. The first Alpha Metroid shoots projectiles and quickly rushes Samus with this dash attack. But that dash makes it susceptible to the melee counter, and we get some nifty cinematic angles of Samus making quick work of it. This fight isn't difficult, but it helps give an idea for what's to come for the rest of the game. Like every other enemy, you're not just spamming shots into a slow-moving, static creature. It tries to defend itself. It makes the battles more engaging and, well, dynamic. From here, the game continues to do a good job of telling the story through subtext. In the original, killing all the Metroids in an area caused this liquid through the planet to lower, which lets you continue on deeper into the next area. But since the game didn't bother communicating most of its story, it didn't explain why killing all the Metroids caused the liquid to lower, or even what the liquid was. Killing the first Metroid in Samus Returns gives us a strand of its DNA, and it's used at this giant mechanism here. These are locks that were built by the Chozo to contain the Metroids under the planet's surface, and unlocking it requires the DNA of all the Metroids in the area that it's guarding, which then causes this big pool of purple flurp to lower. If you ever find yourself stuck at any point, you can also upload any incomplete Metroid data to the lock, and it'll point you in the direction where you may find another Metroid. This takes the functionality of any sort of map room or navigation room that the previous games had, and nothing like that is even featured in Samus Returns at all. One of the biggest new additions in Samus Returns is a new resource called Aeon. Think of it kinda like a magic or mana meter from a more fantasy-styled game like Zelda. Samus can acquire 4 new abilities throughout the game that make use of her Aeon meter, starting with the Scan Pulse. Think of it like the X-ray scope from Super Metroid, but on steroids. It reveals any breakable block in the area of effect, and also unveils the surrounding minimap in a pretty large radius, hence the removal of map rooms. I guess they realized how powerful this ability was, so to help balance it, it makes this horrible beeping noise that makes me want to turn off the volume every time I use it. Again, some purists might see this as Nintendo dumbing down the game and making it less challenging, but it's not like you have to use this ability if you don't want to. Me personally, while I would have preferred the level design to be made in such a way where this type of ability wouldn't even be needed in the first place, I know that's easier said than done, so I'm glad we have some way to cut down on the tedium of bombing every single block if we're ever lost or stuck. Later on, we also get Lightning Armor, which depletes Samus' Aeon meter instead of her health when she takes damage, and it's needed to bypass areas with these poisonous shrubs. It also drastically increases the range and power of the melee counter, so have fun running around pimp-slapping the hell out of everything. There's also the Beam Burst, which replaces Samus' charge beam with a rapid-fire Gatling gun of destruction, but it eats through your Aeon like crazy, so I only use it when I absolutely have to. The final ability, and the least useful one unfortunately, is the Phase Drift. It slows down time around you while you stay the same speed, and it's needed to run through areas with collapsing floor tiles, but that's pretty much the only use you're going to get out of it. The ability is basically like an inverted speed booster, since it would look like you're running super fast from the perspective of the enemies, but I guess it's only here to take its place because the speed booster isn't in this game at all. I was shocked when they cut one of Samus' most iconic abilities, but I don't know, maybe the 3DS just wasn't powerful enough to load in all the assets fast enough when Samus was running at full speed, so they just added this as a compromise. In order to refill Aeon, you can kill just about any enemy, which is slow, or you can find these orbs of Aeon energy that instantly top you off. Energy and missile recharge stations are also back, but I have a few nitpicks with their inclusion. For one, energy and missile stations are put back into separate locations, I'm assuming for parity with the original game. And two, the game makes you sit through this slow cutscene of Samus using the machine, oh here I go, gotta stick my gun arm into this hole, la-dee-da, and it just wastes your time. I feel like this is one of the few aspects of the game that remains somewhat dated, when everything else has been doing a great job of keeping the game up to modern standards. They should have been instant like the Aeon stations. Samus Returns brings back every power-up from the original Metroid 2, alongside other fan favorites that were introduced later. Except the speed booster. This game marks the return of the Spider Ball, which was never in another 2D game after its introduction, and also the Grapple Beam. The Grapple Beam handles much better than it did in Super, but I don't know, I'm still not really a big fan of it here when it comes to swinging across gaps. The timing can still be a little weird. You can now also use it to pull and break certain kinds of blocks, kinda making it like a combination with the Grapple Lasso from Metroid Prime 3. And I like that they gave it some extra utility here. The game even switches to the grapple beam automatically when you're aiming at a grapple block, which is a very nice quality of life change. The grapple beam and spider ball are used much more extensively here in Samus Returns. In the previous games, certain upgrades, and by that I mostly mean the space jump, made previous ones obsolete when they give you an easier way to get around obstacles. But here, item puzzles and progression in general make good use of Samus' upgrades all throughout the game, and I found myself using the Spider Ball in particular quite often, even in the late game. The Ice Beam is now a separate weapon that doesn't stack with the rest of your beam upgrades, although it still serves the same purpose as before. It's also pretty useful against the Metroids this time around, slowing them down and doing a pretty big chunk of damage on its own. And I like that they added this little retcon here, it just adds that tiny little bit of consistency with Fusion. The original Metroid 2's map was very straightforward with very little backtracking, and there was never really a point to ever go back to a previous point of the map. And it's not like the game could just radically redesign the map, that would go against the entire point of it being a faithful remake. Sometimes the best solution to a problem is the easiest one, so Samus Returns has teleport stations littered all throughout the map, which let you go back to any other teleport station you already discovered. As, immersion breaking as they might be, they do come in handy later in the game when you're searching for more upgrades, and they're kind of a necessary evil if this game wants to have any sort of longevity. Making our way through the caves towards the first proper area, my mind can only think of one thing. But to my surprise and shock, the game actually remixes those bleeps and bloops from Metroid 2, and turns it into an actual song. With composition. I think that right there might be this game's greatest achievement, honestly. Of course, when I first played Samus Returns, I never played Metroid 2, so I didn't know about the greatest song known to man here. On this repeat playthrough, I had to check if that song was still in the game, And what do you know? It is! And it also sounds good. Samus Returns remixes pretty much every song from the original Metroid 2. But I mean, that's, what, like 2.5 songs? So alongside those songs, we also get some music remixed from other games. And by that I mean barely changed versions of Super Metroid remixes from the Prime series. Most notably, we have Lower Norfair and Lower Brinstar here, but they sound almost identical to the Magmore Caverns and Torvus Bog, respectively. This game kind of borrows a lot from Prime, actually. Even the item collection jingle is just taken straight from those games. Thankfully, the redesigned areas offer a bit more in originality. Metroid 2 didn't really offer a whole lot to work with, but every area in Samus Returns has some sort of backstory to it, and it serves some kind of purpose in the Chozo civilization and ecosystem on SR388. Area 2 is now a hydroelectric power plant, Area 5 is this marshy jungle, and my personal favorite, Area 7, is a Chozo laboratory, and it's suggested that this is where the Metroids were originally created. These places all look incredible for the 3DS. Samus Returns is one of the very few games that I'd actually consider using the 3D effect on, because these backgrounds look absolutely stunning, and they have so much depth and atmosphere in 3D. I'm really glad we're back to the Super and Zero Mission style of storytelling. It's a lot of show, don't tell here, and I think we really needed that after we had games like Fusion, Prime 3, and Other M. One of my favorite moments from the game's storytelling comes here in Area 3. The area is a factory that develops robots and equipment that can mine the crystals in Area 4, which is a mining facility. However, partway through Area 3, Samus uses the grapple beam to clear some rubble out of the way, and unknowingly activates one of her biggest obstacles throughout the game. This is the Diggerknout, and it's essentially this game's take on the SAX, although it isn't nearly as prominent. Later on in Area 4, we have a second encounter with it, where it chases Samus through these tunnels, and she only has a split second to react to oncoming obstacles and make it to the end of the section. While flashy and frenetic escape sequences have been a part of Metroid since the beginning, it's so unlike Metroid to have an instant kill obstacle like this chasing after you. But hey, I guess with checkpoints this area isn't as frustrating as it could have been. Honestly, the greatest obstacle here isn't the Diggerknout, but rather the controls. They're about as clunky as they were in Super Metroid. Now, Samus has a lot of abilities, old and new, in this game, and the 3DS only has so many buttons to work with. Most of the moves Samus had before are the same as they've been since Fusion, so no complaints there. What's new though, is that Samus toggles between the different Aeon abilities using the D-pad, and activates them by pressing A. This is a really weird and clunky way of handling it. I think it would have made more sense if just tapping the D-pad direction activated the abilities, but that's not all. Switching between the main beam, ice beam, and grapple beam is done by hitting these digital buttons on the touchscreen. Yes, they literally ran out of buttons for the control scheme, and they had to program new ones. What a Chad move. This is also how you toggle between missiles and super missiles while you're holding R. Tapping the map screen also instantly puts Samus into Morph Ball, which is a nice quality of life change instead of having to press down on the circle pad twice. Samus Returns pushes the 3DS to its absolute limit, and by the time you've collected all the abilities, playing the game should look something like this. It's also worth noting that there's no sort of enhancement or option to use the extra buttons when playing on the new 3DS, which is kind of odd. I think the game would have benefited from that. Now, I don't own a capture device of any kind, let alone a 3DS one, so in order to get my own gameplay footage for this video, I emulated it. The reason I bring this up is because while looking for a way to, make it work on my PC, I came across this config for Steam Big Picture that has a usable layout when playing on an Xbox controller. So I launched the emulator through Steam, and this layout is actually really comfortable. I think it's better than playing it on original hardware. Playing the original makes my hands uncomfortable after only about an hour or so of playing, but with the config, I beat the game in only a couple of sittings. It's a bit of a pain in the ass to set up, but I think it's worth it if you already enjoy playing the original on 3DS. This just enhances the experience and lets the positives of the game shine through a lot better. It's also around Area 3 and 4 where you begin to encounter the Gamma Metroids. They're actually considerably tougher than the Alphas this time around, and they continuously employ new attacks as you continue to kill them, so there's a ton more variety here than what we saw in Metroid 2. Some of them even run away, making you chase after them into a completely different room to finish the job. What? Oh, okay, you can cut that out now. Dude, seriously, stop! Yeah, this part sucks. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. You fight Gamma Metroids well into the late game, so this is a constant thing we have to deal with, unfortunately. And the fact that there are 40 Metroids in total, I don't know, man. Even with the increased variety of attacks and patterns, it still gets pretty tiring by the end. I just don't think this concept works very well for an entire game, no matter how refined it is. Zeta Metroids can't fly anymore, but they crawl over the walls and ceilings and litter the room with these bullet-held projectiles. It's actually a super fun and challenging fight, and it even gives the grapple beam some time to shine when you yoink this dude back down on his ass. I can't really say the same for Omega Metroids though. By the time you get to your first one, you're so powered up with super missiles and energy tanks that the fight is over before you even know it. It has some pretty big, flashy attacks, but they're all telegraphed and executed at a snail's pace. So far, this final part of the game is leaving a lot to be desired difficulty-wise, and it's a bit of a shame considering that the game had no problem kicking your teeth in only a few areas ago. Well, right after the first Omega, almost as if the game could read my thoughts, we finally get the battle with the Diggerknout that the game had been foreshadowing for the last several hours. Other than Arachnus, it's the only boss in the game that isn't a Metroid, and it's the only new one added to Samus Returns. Well, at least before the finale, but we'll get to that in a bit. It has so many different attacks and so many different phases. It was built by the Chozo in their robotics facility, and that Chozo tech absolutely tears through Samus' armor. It puts all of her abilities to the test, especially the Spider Ball and Morph Ball bombs, the latter of which being needed to disable the turbines on its arms and to land the killing blow on its head. It's a great fight, and it's satisfying to finally overcome this thing after it gave you so much trouble in the previous areas. Beating the Diggerknout gives access to the Power Bombs, the final upgrade in the game. While there's no Speed Booster or Shine Spark in this game, combining a Power Bomb with the Spider Ball lets Samus perform the Spider Boost, rocketing her straight across the room at breakneck speeds. The weird thing though is that the game doesn't tell you at any point, or otherwise make it obvious that you can even do this. Granted, it's not needed for progression, only a few optional item puzzles, but still. And it's so weirdly specific about how to use it. It only works when Samus has the Spider Ball active. You know, when she should be attached to the floor, but whatever. After clawing our way through the Chozo research facility, and 3 easy Omega fights, we finally enter the Metroid Hive, the Queen's Chamber. The counter might say there's only one Metroid left, but we know that's not true. One last go with a few larva Metroids and we find ourselves face to face with the Queen once again. True to the rest of the game, she's gotten a substantial upgrade in terms of attack variety and sheer difficulty. I died about 3 times during my fight with the original Queen in Metroid 2, and that still holds true here. It's a long, tough, dynamic fight that makes great use of the Spider Ball and Space Jump. Countering the Queen opens her up for an opportunity to lasso her down, and we get the chance to use a familiar exploit, powered up to new heights. I'm sorry. And with that, we're given Samus Returns' take on the original game's most memorable and climactic moment. The entire game was leading up to this moment. This is the reason why the game needed to be remade, and Samus Returns doesn't undersell its importance. It's simple, beautiful, and understated, exactly as it needed to be. So then, where the original game would have had a peaceful, serene walk back to the ship, giving the player a chance to reflect on Samus' merciful decision to spare an innocent life, Samus Returns fills the final hallway with so many enemies that it's practically indistinguishable from the rest of the game. I've seen a lot of people complain that the action-packed ending kills the tone that the original game had, and... Look, I agree that Samus Returns did something different here. It wasn't going to work for everyone, and if it didn't work for you, that's fine. The original Metroid 2 ending is iconic, and it was a bold decision to change the tone of the game so dramatically, but I think it's all about perspective. Humor me for a bit. When Metroid 2 originally came out, Metroids were nothing more than these parasitic abominations that fed on any creature they came into contact with. Not only did they pose a threat when used as a biological weapon, but they were a danger even to their own ecosystem on their home planet. I think this is why Metroid 2's final corridors were so barren and devoid of enemies. The stronger the Metroids got, the more resilient the creatures needed to be to survive, until nothing but the Metroids could make it down there. But then we got Metroid Fusion. It's a bit of a retcon, sure, but we now know that the Metroids were deliberately created by the Chozo to keep the X-Parasites in check, something far worse and more dangerous than the Metroids could ever be. With this new lore in place, it makes sense for the end of the game to be filled with enemies. The Metroids weren't feeding on the regular enemies, they were doing their job, feeding on the X-Parasites. While this new take on the story doesn't have the serene and tranquil atmosphere of the previous one, in my eyes it's a more faithful reimagining of what would be established later on, and for that I give this new ending a lot of respect. So, what would have been a straight shot back to the ship is now an opportunity to go on the 100% item hunt. And the baby Metroid actually follows you around throughout the planet, and it can even break these crystals, almost kind of making it like another item or ability in your arsenal. And I kinda like this. It really strengthens the bond between Samus and the Metroid, making their relationship in Super all the more tragic. Unfortunately, all the backtracking to get 100% items is even more tiring than it was in Fusion. The linear design of the map makes it a pain to backtrack through, even with the teleport stations. And there's a lot of items to collect right now. There are so many items that are placed in areas that you can't reach at the time you first see them, so this is the only point in the game where it's really worth it to be backtracking, so you can collect all of them at once. Even then, just going back and collecting all the items took me nearly 2 hours. That's how long it took me to 100% Zero Mission from the beginning of the game. Samus Returns overall is the longest 2D Metroid game, by far. My final completion time was 6.5 hours, when all the other games didn't even reach half that. I mean, it makes sense, just look at this map. Every area is almost like an entire previous game's map on its own. But unfortunately, even with that arduous comb-over of the entire game, that's still not enough to truly 100% Samus Returns. This is my biggest issue with the entire game, and it isn't really a part of the game itself. Content that can't be accessed in any other way is locked behind Amiibo figures. The game launched with 2 of its own figures, but it's also compatible with the Smash 4 Samus ones. Tapping any of the Samus figures gives access to reserve tanks for energy, missiles, or Aeon while in-game, and access to art galleries and the sound test from the menu. Look, you can argue that these are just bonuses, and that having them behind an Amiibo paywall is fine. I don't agree with that, but at least the reserve tanks and galleries don't have much of an effect on the actual gameplay. But then we come to the Metroid Amiibo. Tapping it in-game reveals the location of a Metroid in the area, which is already a pretty good deal. But tapping it on your save file in the menu after beating the game unlocks Fusion Mode, the game's hardest difficulty. And this is the only way to access this challenge. If you don't unlock it, the option is hidden and replaced with a button to tap your Amiibo so you can unlock it. I'm gonna be blunt here, this is complete bullshit. Again, if Fusion Mode was like a cosmetic outfit or something, I'd still disagree with locking it exclusively behind an Amiibo, but it would have made a little bit of sense. But this is the game's hardest challenge, one of the greatest feats to accomplish in the entire series, and it's locked away behind a plastic figure that they don't even manufacture anymore. By the way, hope you aren't planning on buying any of these figures secondhand anytime soon. So, I don't own any Metroid Amiibo, but how did I get Fusion Mode on my 3DS then? Well, I bought these fan-made Amiibo cards off of Etsy, and they actually have the same NFC data as the plastic figures. I would leave a link to their page in the description where you can buy your own, they're really nice, but this happened. I think Nintendo's ninja lawyers may have gotten to them. If I ever hear that they reopen the page, I'll update the description and leave a pinned comment. I'd recommend these if you can get your hands on them. So, with all those grievances laid out, and with all those items fully collected, we're ready to take on the game's greatest challenge. It isn't really a surprise that something is up at this point. Health and ammo recharge stations right before the finale? A dark and stormy sky on the planet's surface? No, nothing fishy here at all. That is the one thing I don't really like about this game's ending sequence, because this should have been the game's greatest surprise. Alright, even though I saw something coming, I was still floored when I first saw this. Ridley famously never made an appearance in the original Metroid 2, despite later going on to be Samus' arch nemesis. And I absolutely love his inclusion here. It's so good to finally see him again. He has these cybernetic implants helping to bridge the gap between Meta Ridley's appearance in the Prime series and Ridley's fully organic appearance in Super. In contrast to the extremely easy final battles of most of the previous games, Ridley is a tough fight, and he completely walled me for quite a while on my first playthrough. Nowadays I don't think he's really as tough as the Queen Metroid or even the Diggerknout, but it's a climactic, epic battle that serves the story extremely well. And he still hits like a truck, don't get me wrong. Ridley's goal here is to capture the baby Metroid, just as he would eventually go on to do in Super. He eventually gets the upper hand on Samus, but then... oh, this fight is so heartwarming. The bond between Samus and the baby Metroid is established here in full force, and the baby proves that it will fight to protect its mother no matter what, just as it would continue to do only one game later. From that point, it begins helping her during the fight, giving her energy and Aeon at the start of each new phase. Eventually, the pair is able to fend off Ridley, and Samus and Metroid fly off into space, kicking off the events of Super Metroid. Whew. And that was Metroid Samus Returns. I didn't think I'd have so much to say about this game, but I think this is going to end up being the longest review yet. Above any sort of praise or criticism that I have for this game, I'm simply just glad that it exists in the first place. That Metroid was given another chance after it was forgotten and ignored for nearly 7 years. No, this doesn't count. In terms of the product that we actually got, yeah, I actually really enjoy this one. Look, it might fumble with the controls, and the enemy variety, and the pacing, and it might completely miss the tone of the game that it's based on, but Samus Returns is a challenging, fast-paced, action-packed adventure through SR388. The Aeon powers add so much versatility to Samus' arsenal, and the melee counter adds so much more depth to the combat, even if it breaks the flow of the game a little bit. The game looks and sounds amazing for the 3DS, and for being the first 2D game to use 3D models and environments, they nailed the transition perfectly. It's more than just a remake of Metroid 2, it's the starting blueprint for the series going forward. Metroid Dread is going to be developed by MercurySteam once again, and I'm glad that these guys are getting a second chance, they really deserve it. It seems like they're taking people's criticisms to heart because by the looks of things, Dread is going to fix almost everyone's biggest complaints with Samus Returns. Going back to non-linear design, being able to melee while running, brand new upgrades alongside returning favorites, and no sign of locking exclusive content behind Amiibos. Oh, I'm so excited, and I'm usually the type to try to not get hyped for new games anymore, but I just can't help myself here. I was honestly pretty worried that we'd never see another 2D Metroid game like this for quite a while longer. The sales figures of Samus Returns admittedly left a lot to be desired. Metroid games in general have never sold particularly well, but I feel like Samus Returns might have sold so poorly because it released on the 3DS right in the midst of the Switch craze. I mean, I'd believe it. I'm the one that ignored it for months after getting my Switch. But all signs are pointing towards Metroid Dread selling very well. I'm not a betting man, but I have a feeling that it's going to be the best-selling game in this series. Switch games in general just sell an absolutely asinine number of units.
You what?
And with the story behind the game's development and the sheer amount of promotion and attention it's been getting on social media from Nintendo, yeah, I just don't think there's any way this game doesn't sell super well, at the very least in relation to other Metroid games. But anyway, I think that does it for my 2D Metroid review series. I had a ton of fun making it, and I hope you enjoyed watching them. As per usual, please let me know if you want to see any more videos like this in the future, maybe covering some other game series. Like, comment, subscribe, whatever. Do what you gotta do to show your interest for these kinds of videos from me. My next video will most likely be a less formal first impressions of Metroid Dread after I played it for a little bit. I don't know when that'll come out, probably either a few days or a week-ish after the game's launch, but I'll try to get out fairly quick. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time for Metroid Dread. Take care.